So as the students and I had these conversations, we began to understand why researchers draw important distinctions between deliberate practice and other related activities like work or play or performance or rote repetition, which will not automatically improve performance. I can see, it's really interesting, isn't it? Nobody wants to stop talking. I completely understand. I don't want to ever stop. You didn't finish, I'm sure. But keep talking about it later, okay? In the meantime, we'll go through we talked about what those elements are of deliberate practice that make researchers say that it really works. And one thing you might do right now is think about the thing you were just describing and ask yourself, are these elements of practice, when you're practicing, are these elements there? Because if they are there, then your practice is definitely effective. So the first element is, because this works, by the way, whether you're learning cartooning or basketball or ballroom dance or rocket science. So it also works in the classroom, in the K-12 classroom. So let's look at some examples. First of all, deliberate practice has an express purpose. It's there for a purpose. It's not just random. You're practicing something. And that something involves your attention and your focus. You can't practice well without paying attention and being focused on the thing. That something is also geared to what you need to practice, what you yourself need to practice, not what everybody else needs to practice, or your sister or brother or your classmate needs to practice, what you yourself need. That practice always involves some kind of repetition, doing it again and again, or rehearsal. And it always is intended to lead to new knowledge and skills, to cement some new knowledge and skills. And if it's done well, then it also leads to even more complex knowledge and skills. In other words, practice isn't over when you've done that day's practice. You're moving on then to some more complicated kind of practice. Let's look at some examples. Let's say you want kids to be able to understand an important math concept, like how to, say, combine different kinds of fractions, multiply or divide fractions. You've got to give them something to practice that will help that concept stick in their minds, right? They've got to be practicing. We know that. Well, I was one of those kids that if you gave me a worksheet full of number problems, I'd be just as likely to, forget it or lose it. Numbers just made me nervous. But one day in our homework group, the teacher brought in 2 pizzas for us 5 kids. And one of them was cut into 3 slices and one of them was cut into 4 slices. And she told us, figure out how each of you can get an equal amount of pizzas from these. So pretty quick we started out guessing, but soon we began to get the idea of how to do that math. And that pizza practice wasn't just a sheet of numbers to us. It had the express purpose of answering a question that we actually cared about, and we valued it because we were hungry. And we realized also that we could succeed at it if we tried. We didn't think we'd succeed right away, but we knew we would succeed because we wanted it to be fair. So value times expectation equals motivation. Let's look at the attention and focus. Now, attention and focus, that means in the classroom, that would mean staying away from busy work, right? It would probably mean staying away from rote learning and instead coming up with a thinking task that would require you to be thinking about it while you were repeating it again and again. For example, say the teachers in the room wanted all of us to know the 50 United States and where each of them stands on the map in relation to the others. They could make us try to memorize that by rote. Maybe they'd even have some mnemonic devices, some little tricks to help us memorize it. Or they might instead focus our attention by asking each of us to gather at a table with each other to draw a freehand map of the United States, starting with where we were all from and building out from there based on where other people are from. They might even make a contest of it and say, who's going to get to that first, and put a little fun value into it. And even if we didn't get it right exactly the first time, you can bet that we've got our attention on the knowledge that we'd be building. We'd be thinking about it. What about geared to the individual? We all know that any particular task will be easy for some of us and hard for others. Take reading, for example. If you want somebody to read better, think back on what Uma was telling us earlier about getting hooked on a book series that her friend really liked. In order to keep reading enough to get really good at it, developing readers need to start with books that are geared to their individual level so that they can expect to get through them, and their interests so that they value reading them, even if that means reading Uma's vampire books. And that is what will make their practice effective. And from that, they can go on to more complex. It doesn't mean they'll be reading vampire books all their lives. She was reading James Baldwin by the time I interviewed her. But she was talking about her 7th and 6th grade experience. Now, repetition and rehearsal are also an essential part of deliberate practice. For example, any task that involves presentation in front of other people requires rehearsing something repeatedly. So does learning a foreign language. You just can't do it once and expect to know it. And maybe going through several drafts of a written essay. That counts as repetition and rehearsal. It may not be inherently fun, and that researchers tell us that deliberate practice is not inherently fun, but it has an express purpose. And the good thing is that you can actually feel yourself improving when you're doing it. Let's not forget, deliberate practice is aimed to lead to those new knowledge, that new knowledge and those new skills, and those will usually lead to realizing we need more. So, for example, if a science class goes out in the community to evaluate its local water quality, they come back, they do their work, they measure up things, and kids inevitably come up with new questions that could take further experiments to answer. And they keep stretching. As they keep stretching for more, they are acquiring the same habits that expert scientists use all the time. So we've just run through all the ways how this deliberate practice helps students develop academic knowledge and skills. But remember a while back I told you how my practice project students realized that what they were getting better at had a lot in common with what the experts they interviewed told them about how they worked. So we started to make this list of we called it expert habits of mind and expert habits of work, the habits of experts, that spelled out how people who were really good at something thought about what they were working on and how they actually did their work. So no matter what we're helping students get good at, and it could be really anything from from science class to speaking a new language, we have to provide tasks that give them practice in these give them deliberate practice in these expert habits. And so how do we do that? We do it just like we do with everything else they're learning. We recognize these habits, we assess these habits, we chart these habits, and we celebrate their small steps on the way to thinking and working like the experts do. So assessment is a big part of this, and celebration, recognizing.